I'm here to speak to you about God. I offer myself to thee to build with me and do with me as thy will. Relieve me of the bondage of self that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties that victory over them may bear witness through those I would help of thy power, thy love, thy way of life. May I do thy will always. And I'm going to share with you this morning a little bit about myself. I'm going to share how the third step came into my life and how I'm working it today. But before I do that, I'd like to thank Jim for asking me to come and talk about the third step here. And I also want to say that Jim is our iTech guy here in Palm Springs, California, Cathedral City. He not only put this whole thing together, but every morning, 7 days a week, he put together Zoom that all of us can participate in. And Jim, I thank you for all your work that you do. And I also, all the work that you do. What I'm going to do is share a little bit about how I came into Alcoholics Anonymous. And that was by the hand of God. And how all that happened in my life was about 5 or 6 years into Alcoholics Anonymous, I was having a conversation with my older sister, a sister that all I did was cause all kinds of problems to, a mother that I disrespected, younger brothers, aunts, uncles, cousins, the community, all the havoc that I raised in my life while I was drinking and doing some drugs. But during this conversation, my sister said, you know, Marty, I prayed many years ago that if you weren't going to change your life, that you would peaceably die in your sleep. And I believe her prayers were answered, as well as prayers from another person. And this other person, his name was John. And I'm going to talk about him a little bit because John was a drunk, he was a lush. And I caused John a whole lot of problems in his life with the IRS. I caused him problems with state and federal law enforcement agencies. I had him go to a federal courtroom, I did. But John was a lush and nobody was going to believe him. Well, the fact of the matter is, everybody believed John and nobody believed Marty. My God. So, John belonged to an organization, and that organization was called Alcoholics Anonymous, and I never heard of it. All I knew is that drunks went there, and I wasn't part of that group. Well, causing John all those problems, and he lived in Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm sure he went back to his sponsor, he went back to his home group, and he said, that little son of a from Chicago, burn in hell. And I'm sure having a sponsor and other people in AA, they all told him, listen, you do what the big book tells us. You get down on your knees and you pray that that little guy from Chicago gets everything that you want for yourself. And I believe that the prayers of John and my sister were answered, and the hand of God came into my life, and I wound up in a situation that I was most comfortable with. It was a situation that was no big deal. It was good old home week. And uh, but there was something different about it, and the difference was I felt bad inside of me. I felt bad. And we talk about the moment of clarity that we have. Well, I had more than a moment of clarity. I had several weeks of clarity in my life. And by that, I mean, I thought about my family. I thought about two divorced wives that I caused nothing but pain and shame and embarrassment. I thought about my children and how I neglected them. And by today's standards, and I say that again, by today's standards, I would probably be accused of child abuse. Drinking and drugging was more important than taking care of my family, than paying the rent, than having a decent relationship with the woman who gave me birth and all my siblings. And during this 2-week period, I started to think about those things, and I heard everything that people said to me. Marty, leave it alone. You can't drink. I think about my brother who said to me, you're nothing but a bum, Marty. You're never going to amount to anything. And that brother, many years later, because I'm a proud member of Alcoholics Anonymous, he met me at the Greyhound bus station and he put his arms around me and he said, Marty, welcome home. And he let me live in his crib for 1 year rent-free. He paid for the food and any other expenses that were there. But going back to that situation I was in, that environment that I was most comfortable with, feeling bad about myself, one day I happened to look on the wall and there was a dirty sign up there. And that sign said AAOM, Officer's Mess. And I don't know why, but that gripped me, it did. And I know that was the hand of God working in my life, opening up my eyes, opening up my heart to Him and not myself. So I looked at that, and when 7 o'clock came, I went down to my wife's cell phone is going off. Jean, if you would silence your cell phone, please. Thank you. Incidentally, she's my third wife. We've been together 18 years. No, we've been married 18 years. We've been together for 25 years. And do you know, that's probably the hardest I've talked to my wife in 25 years. We communicate on a mental, psychological, and spiritual basis. Getting back to that sign, though, where it said OM, Officer's Mess, 7 o'clock move. I told this guy, Tim, I said, Tim, I'm going to go down to that AA place and see what those folks have to say. And he said to me, Marty, that's for drunks. You're not a drunk. I said, I know I'm not, but I'm still going to go down there. I am. So I walked into that room, my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and a bunch of liars and thieves and dope fiends and drunks said, Marty, and I say this to the new people, welcome to the greatest adventure of your life. You will do things that you never thought possible, and I certainly have. Considering I'm a snot-nosed kid from the streets of Chicago, born and raised there, here I am from Chicago in Palm Springs, California, blue skies, the sun is shining, I have a decent automobile, I took a shower and shaved this morning, I have clean clothes on. Now, is that not the hand of God working in my life? I certainly think so. And talking about clothes, I'm going to take a side trip here, and I hope to come back on base. But while I was getting dressed this morning, just to show you, if there's a loophole to be found, Marty will find it. I put on my shirt, and I put on a tie, and I put on my jacket. I did. And I thought to myself, I don't have to put on my pants. I could wear my short pants and my white socks and my sandals. Well, you know what? Half measures avail nothing. And I knew I wasn't going to be real happy. So I marched right back into the closet and I got my trousers that go with my jacket and I got a dark pair of socks and I put on my Sunday shoes I did. So here I am again. But getting back to that first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, because something happened there that I really believe is important. And that is, there was a volunteer there by the name of Frank. And Frank took a liking to me, and he gave me one of these cards. I don't know if you could see it. Oh, flipped over here it did. And it has chapter 5 on it, the 12 steps, and on the back of it, it has the 3rd and 7th step prayer. And Frank said to me, Marty, I want you to go back and I want you to every morning get on your knees and say that 3rd step prayer. And I looked at Frank and I said, Frank, give me a break now. Would you please? My God, you're forgetting where we're at. And I'm in with the Colombians and they like me and I get along with everybody. My God, and talking about being a people pleaser in those days, I knew how to people please for my own self-preservation. But I said, Frank, the Colombians are going to go out on the yard and they're going to say, the gringo has gone loco. Watch out for him. He's on his knees. He's praying. Look out. So that was the word that was out on the yard. And Frank said to me very calmly, he just looked at me and said, Marty, I don't care what they think. I care about what you do. And when he said that to me, he was probably the first man that touched my heart because I knew that he cared about me. He cared about my welfare. He cared about my spirituality. He cared about my mindset. And that happened in a blink of an eye. But I had some choices. I could go back the next week and I could lie to Frank and say I did it. Or I didn't have to go to that meeting. It wasn't mandatory. Or I could go and tell him the truth. And that's what I did. I went and I told him the truth. And I said, Frank, I started saying that third step prayer on my knees every morning. And I just want to thank you for that. Because already I'm feeling certain little nudges and doing this and doing that. And I knew that's the hand of God working in my life. My anniversary date is May 1, 1984. My sponsor's name is Chris. Chris is sponsored by Jim. We meet Sunday mornings right outside of Chicago in a suburb at 6:30 in the morning. My sponsor is entirely different than me. He's a businessman. He's solid. He has both feet on the ground. I can get a little lofty at times, to say the least. And by that, I mean I can be driven by my impulsiveness. I can. So I check in with my sponsor here from Palm Springs 2 to 3 times a week. When I say I want to thank Jim for asking me to come here, this is quite an honor for me because I don't do this thing. If I do it twice a year, it's a whole lot. And when he asked me, I was hit with fear. Well, if I turn my life and my will over to the care of God, what am I scared about? You're not going to like me. You're going to throw stones at me. You're going to talk about me. I'm a child of God and God has got my back. And for that, I am grateful. So what do? I do a lot of H&I work, and I'm giving H&I a plug now because if there's anybody out there who wants to do H&I work and you might say to yourself that, you know, I've never been in a drunk tank. I've never been in a lockup, let alone the joint. I've never been into that kind of situation. And my answer to you is great. Because the women and men who are incarcerated, they don't need to hear blood and gut stories. They have their own blood and gut stories. What they need to hear is the big book and the 12 and 12 of Alcoholics Anonymous. So take a risk, fill out them papers. I'll give you a hard time. That's been going on for 35 years that I know of, and it will continue to be that way. But you wade through the paperwork and you will get the rewards that you have never thought imaginable. So that's a little plug about H&I work. So getting back to saying that third step prayer in the morning and all the good things that I experienced during that time. The goal of most cons or most people who are incarcerated is to get out, whether they sham, whether they lie, whether they manipulate. The goal is to get out. It wasn't that way for me because these were exciting years of my life. I came out of Atlanta. Howard came out of Lewisburg, and we met in Kentucky in a federal setting there. And Howard was wonderful. And two of the things that he taught me was, Marty, you tell your own story and you take your own inventory. And to this very day, I try and do just that. And talking about the 12-step prayer, the third step prayer, going back to the first time I said that to this morning, I probably missed saying it 2, 3 400 times maybe in the last 35 years. Now I don't say it on my knees anymore. I'm 80 and I can't get down there as easy as I used to, let alone getting up. So I'll say it while I'm horizontal. Sometimes I'll say it at the kitchen table. Sometimes I'll hold my wife's hand and we'll say the third together. And she always likes to say the Lord's Prayer. And that's something else that I've been taught in AA. Wilson talks about it on page 87. We ask our family or our ministers to join us in morning prayer. It took me a long time, but I finally got the courage to ask my wife to join me in morning prayers and that. I don't do much meditating this morning. In the mornings, I do a 12-minute meditation to kind of calm myself down. But going back to the situation that I was in, and I don't like to use slang words, the joint and that. So I'll say, going back to that kind of a situation, the goal of prisoners are to get out of those places. Well, not for me, because those are exciting years in my life. I did my best meditation, my best fasting. I read the big book. I read the 12 and 12. I chaired meetings inside there. And it was a time in my life for mental, psychological, and mainly and most importantly, spiritual growth. It was. So I never looked to get out. So you talk about the hand of God. One day I'm coming up the hill from Unicor, which is Federal Prison Industries, and I get called into my case manager's office. And whenever that happens, or you get called into the captain's office, you know something went down. And the first defense I come out with, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. I don't know what you're talking about. Well, I went into my case manager's office and I just stood there because I really didn't know why he called me in there. Well, he had a yellow piece of paper and he was waving it in front of me and he says, Cap, he says, I don't know who you know, but the Southeastern U.S. Parole Commission decided to grant you a parole. Well, pick me up off the floor. The hand of God working in my life. I could have taken that and went out on the yard and boasted and bragged and fed my ego and said, don't you guys know who I know in Washington, D.C.? I have connections. No, I didn't do none of that stuff. In fact, I kept quiet about it for a couple months until the date came of my release. But in the meantime, I'm saying my third I am, and I'm going into the seventh, and I'm thanking God humbly on my knees each and every day for the life that He has given me. So the day comes for my release, and I ride the Greyhound bus all the way to Chicago. And I told you who met me at that bus station. The guy who said to me, my brother, who said to me, Marty, you're never going to amount to anything. You're a bum. He put his arms around me. He put me in his car and he took me home. And like I said, he let me live there for 1 year, food and rent free. Now, couple things here that I want to touch on. One is I want to touch on Mildred. I met Mildred. She doesn't remember me because I was sitting in the audience with several thousand other alcoholics at State Line Retreat. And Mildred got up there and shared her story several times. And she always touched my heart. And when she was getting her innovations and she was prostate there, she spoke in Latin, and those words went right to my heart, and I just wanted Mildred to know that. And when Ann was speaking, she triggered a few thoughts in my head too when she talked about the ballpark. Well, what I remember about the ballpark is hot dog and a bottle of beer. Well, for Marty, it was hot dog and 10 bottles of beer and a flask of vodka in my back pocket. That's what I remember about the ballpark. And I also thank Ann for her knowledge of the big book and the insight that she had there. And I don't take myself so seriously. I think I may have said that. I take my responsibility seriously, and I learned to wear the world like a loose garment. And by wearing it like a loose garment, I don't have to argue or get cantankerous with people anymore. And if people have their opinions, let them have their opinions. My God, who am I to try to change somebody else? When Howard said to me, Marty, you're a big enough job, just work on changing yourself. And I've tried to do that. And I've been most fortunate in my life. When I got out, I told you what my brother did. My parents were still alive at that time, and I made my amends to them. In fact, it got a little embarrassing because my mom would brag about her older son and that. But the fact is, I made my amends to my mom and dad, to my brother who picked me up there at the Greyhound bus station, to my other brother, to my older sister. And my older sister, I want to just talk about her for a minute because in my last days of drinking, I used to go to those gin mills. And when I walked in those gin mills, the bartender did two things. He pointed at me and he pointed at the door, pointed at me and he pointed at the door. And at that time, I knew there was nothing, there was no, who you talking about? Me? What did I do? There was none of that stuff, you know. And the old gang of mine was stay away from Marty. He's lost it all. And I told you about the prayer that my sister prayed, that I would peaceably die in my sleep if I wasn't going to change. Well, here I am in Alcoholics Anonymous, and we're having a conversation. And she was just filled with so much joy. And I made my amends to her, and we talked about life, and we talked about spirituality, and we talked about God. And I was there when I buried my sister. My brother died in June. My brother-in-law, he was the guy who said, Mary, here comes your brother, lock the doors and windows, nail everything shut. He wasn't thrilled with my shenanigans and the things that I did. But because of the love he had for my sister, he would allow me into the house. And in those days, I was able to put the squeeze on my sister. Mary, you got a 20 I can borrow from you. You got a 10 I can borrow from you. And he knew that was going on, but he didn't say anything. He would just walk into the other room while my sister and I sat at the kitchen table, and I put the squeeze on her for some money. When I'm in AA, though, I sit at the kitchen table and I talk to my sister about God and about spirituality. My brother died in June, my brother-in-law died in November, and my sister died in January. And during that time, I wasn't Marty the drunk. I wasn't crazy Marty, but I was Marty that was filled with God's spirit because of the things I learned in Alcoholics Anonymous. And instead of people looking down at me, and this may sound egotistical, and I don't mean it to, people looked up to me. It was a time in my life when I felt good about. My name's Marty. It's not Willie or Joe or Rocky or anything else. My name's Marty, and I'm a proud member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I went through the burial there. And you talk about this being a genetic disease. My son was 31 years old, a wife and two children, a chip off the old block he was. And his theme song was my theme song. It'll never happen to me. It'll never happen to me. Well, the fact of the matter is he died at Chicago's Northwestern Hospital. He did, left a wife and two children. This being a genetic disease, my grandson, who's now 33 years old, is up in Lake County, and Lake County has a jail up there. And unfortunately, my grandson visits that jail simply because he's like his grandfather was. He's a drunk. I tried to talk to Michael in that. I tried to talk to my own son, but I learned the lesson that you don't 12-step family members. And what I probably did, and sometimes I have a twinge of guilt in my life when I think about that, because I No, I may have left the bitter taste in their mouth of Alcoholics Anonymous. They both went to meetings, but meetings just weren't for them. My grandson, he's alive yet, and every now and then I'll just be a grandpa. I won't be a member of AA to him. We'll just have a conversation as grandpa to a grandson. Yeah. So, uh, so I experienced that I did. And the hand of AA working in my life, other events in my life, and I would just like to talk about a couple of those events. And my time is getting short here, so I'll wind it up shortly. But one of those events in my life was my brother. He was diagnosed with cancer, and uh, and it was the kind of cancer that killed you. And one day we're standing on the street. But prior to that, I go to mass with my wife, and there's the consecration, and there's the wine and the host. And I always take the host. But this time I was hit with such a wave of gratitude, of such a wave of spirituality. I got up and I went and I took that cup of wine and I touched it to my lips. And at that moment, I knew my brother was going to continue living. And I went and I sat down, and my wife, knowing a bit about alcoholism, she said to me, Marty, do I have to be careful here? What's going to go on here? Because she knew about one's too many, you know. And I said, Jane, I said, I was hit with a wave of spirituality I just can't describe. Back to the streets, when I'm talking to my brother, our cars are parked by the curb, and I'm looking at my brother, and I said, George, I says, you're going to be okay, Yar. And he was. He had the killer cancer, and for the next 6 years, George continued living a full life. And at that time, the cancer came back again. And once again, I knew George has fulfilled his mission on this earth, and it was his turn to go to our spiritual heavens. And that's what George did. And at his wake, I officiated, and there were men there that he counseled. My brother was into education, and there were men there that he counseled, people I never even knew that got up and spoke nothing but praises. And he's the brother that said, Marty, and you know what he said, but he's also the brother that put his arms around me and said, welcome home. I'd like, so those events are hand of God's working in my life. And I'm looking at a few things here, and I think I covered everything. One last thing that Mildred talked about, the prayer of St. Francis, Mildred. That's many, many years ago. I put together a group of guys, and each morning, whoever wakes up first takes one line of the prayer of St. Francis, and we focus in on that line. And today's line happened to be to love rather than to be loved. My prayer is that I was able to share some of the love that was given to me so that I gave it back to all of you, and I thank you. That's it.